have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green. Thank you for joining us today. You found us in the middle of a three-part series. Today is the second part. It's with George Barna. George was with us over at the Pro-Family Legislators Conference a few months back. That's where we bring in state reps and senators from around the nation, give them a chance to exchange ideas, to share things that are going well in their states or things that are going the wrong direction, and get ideas on how to turn it around. At that conference, we have a lot of great speakers that are experts on the culture and how to win the culture war. George Barna is one of those guys. Just phenomenal research that he's done, 48 books that he's written. He is a respected expert by so many in Christian circles, in the media, in politics. Pastors study him. He just does a great job of equipping you with information that will help you make good decisions. And not only folks in those leadership positions, I have loved his books myself. His books on parenting are fantastic. I've learned so much and applied so much. I encourage you to check out his book, Revolutionary Parenting, and so many others of his books. His website is barna.org. But we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. If you missed yesterday for some reason, you can go right now to wallbuilderslive.com, click on the archives, and grab yesterday's program, and you'll be caught up. Today will be the second part, and we'll finish it up tomorrow. But let's pick up right where we left off yesterday with George Barna.
What we find, and this is interesting to me, is a radical shift in terms of how many people believe someone is born homosexual as opposed to choosing to become homosexual. Whereas back in 1978, only 13% of Americans said you're born gay. Now that's roughly half of Americans who believe that. Very, very significant shift. We find that 2/3 of Americans believe that discrimination against people who are gay or lesbian is serious. We find that 4 out of 10 say that it would be difficult for people to live as an openly gay person in their community. We find that Americans are about evenly split on the idea of will issues related to homosexuality always divide Americans. About half of Americans say yes, they will. Half say no, we're going to get over it. We look at the fact that when it comes to same-sex marriage, a small majority now believe that it should be legal. It has essentially doubled since 1996. We know as well that currently 4 out of 10, however, say that legalizing same-sex marriage will make society worse, and 40% say it will have no effect. Only about 20% believe that it will make our society a better place. The impression is that when you look at all Americans, the average American would say about 2/3 of the population is opposed to same-sex marriage. And also related to this is the fact that currently interest in traditional marriage and support for traditional marriage is declining. Over the last 7 years, we've seen about a 12-point decline in people who support the idea of traditional marriage. There's a lot of dynamics behind that. We've got all kinds of information about single adults not being interested in getting married, saying cohabitation will do just fine, or other kinds of things. So it gets a little complex. Now, the idea is for you just to have a sense of where things stand with these. Can these numbers, these proportions and ratios change? Absolutely. They change all the time for reasons I'm going to describe in just a moment. I want you to understand that right now we are in the midst of one of those cyclical periods where the pendulum is swinging. The pendulum is always swinging. And if you study the cycles of history, you see that every 30 to 40 years we swing from conservative back to liberal, back to conservative. And so we're in one of those eras right now where the pendulum is past the midpoint and is more on the liberal end of the continuum. That will come back eventually. It may not swing back as far to the right as it once had, because what we're seeing is that that continuum is shrinking a bit. And so that's something to be concerned about and aware of. But I think if all we do is we focus on these kinds of opinions related to abortion, same-sex marriage, or any other issue, we're kind of missing the point. I think there's a much deeper issue for us to understand if we're going to be effective in terms of crafting and passing legislation. And that's what I want to talk with you about. Now, I'm guessing by virtue of the fact that most of the people sitting here ran for office, you consider yourself to be a leader. And so the question is, well, but what does a leader do? You read 12 books on leadership, you'll get 18 definitions of what leadership is. But what I want to do is share with you my definition of it, which is essentially that what we do as leaders is we motivate, mobilize, direct, and resource people toward a shared vision. As Christian leaders, that shared vision should be a vision from God. That's not always the case in a secular society, but I think that's one of the things that distinguishes us as Christians, is that nobody should give a rip about your vision. Everybody should care about the vision that God has entrusted to you on their behalf. And so, question number one is, what is the vision that God's implanted in your heart as to what you're going to do for Him as a leader? If you don't have that, you shouldn't be leading. You're part of the problem if you don't understand that as a starting point. But, as we look at this, and if we take a macro level look at our society, I would suggest to you that gauging what our leaders have done in the last century or so, the American dream, that concept, has really been a shorthand representation of the vision for our country. That whole idea of the American dream actually comes out of a book that was written by historian James Adams back in 1931, where he described what that was, and that concept has stood the test of time as Americans have energetically embraced that idea and pursued it. But I want to suggest to you that the American dream, at least in its classic definition, either has been or certainly is far down the road in terms of being replaced as the ideal for what our society pursues.
Red, White, Blue, and Green is a new reality show following the Green family around the nation, rediscovering the American principles that made us the most successful nation in the history of the world. You can be a part of launching this new reality series by visiting rickgreen.com and clicking on the Red, White, Blue, and Green tab. Here's a sneak peek from the pilot episode. Rick Green coming to you live from the Lone Star State of Texas, a beacon of hope and freedom to liberty lovers around the world. Today I'm thinking about why do we do what we do? Because everywhere we go as a family, when we're traveling and speaking, someone comes up to us and asks, where's the hope? Is it over for America? They genuinely feel like the stars and stripes are fading. I felt that. But when I look at my family, whether it's my son Trey and his drive to exceed expectations, or Reagan and his love for serving and teaching other people, Cameron and her determination to outperform her brothers in everything she does, or my little stagehound Rhett and his boundless enthusiasm. Through their eyes, I see a vibrant nation. When my children stand in the birthplace of the Constitution, or on battlefields where patriots gave their lives, I can see in them a rekindled flame of the American spirit. The future of my children's country is bright because it's built on the foundation of an incredible providential history. A history of patriots and pastors, entrepreneurs and freedom fighters, mothers, fathers, families like yours and mine, who chose to live like their nation depended on it. And it still does. So when people ask us, where is the hope? We tell them, it's in you. Each of us, every individual, every family, has a duty to fight for freedom and add our voice, our color, to the American dream. For our family, it's red, white, and blue, and a little bit of green. To learn more about Red, White, Blue, and Green, visit rickgreen.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
The question to those of us in here, perhaps more so than any other group that I could be talking to, is, are we going to capitulate and embrace this newly redefined dream, or will we stand firm and champion the original dream, perhaps with different language and imagery and messages, but with the same core concept? See, what happened was, in the aftermath of World War I, Americans fell in love with FDR and his sweeping New Deal programs. There was all kinds of rich rhetoric, but the idea behind so much of what he was promoting was that each day could be better than the last. And the American dream was part of that philosophical heartbeat. It was a period of optimism. It was a time when society believed in the American dream because what it promoted was living a better, richer, and fuller life with greater, broader, grander opportunities than had ever been possible before. And how far you got was simply based on what you did with those opportunities. It was based on your abilities and your achievements. But all kinds of things intervened in the 7 or so decades after the New Deal was introduced. And I think there were two big blows to the dream that really set things in motion in a different direction. The first of those happened September 11, 2001. The first major attack on American soil, and then the second blow really happened toward the end of 2007 when our economy really began to fall apart for a variety of reasons. But the reality is, at the same time that all of that happened, we began redefining our national priorities and our economic base. And as a result of that, we began to rethink and consequently redefine some of our core perceptions about life. And one of those has to do with our view of the future. See, for several decades, we defined the American dream as having or giving us the chance to maximize our potential through a combination of unprecedented opportunities, applied intelligence, and hard work. But now we're dealing with two younger generations in particular that are pushing a new idea, a new ideal of what that American dream is and should be. See, because now the revised dream is not about productivity, it's not about achievement, it's about rights, it's about entitlement, it's about experiences, it's about independence, and it's about control. A recent survey showed us that 3/4 of all Americans, when asked to describe what the American dream is, now define it as the freedom for anyone to live life however they choose. Think about that for a moment, because that is really the antithesis of what the original dream was about. See, this redefinition of the dream is also accompanied by a pretty serious shift in a whole set of perceptions of what goes into making the dream happen. You think about the original dream, more than 4 out of 5 Americans believed home ownership was one of the things that you worked for and that the dream allowed you to accomplish. But today, barely half of Americans believe that home ownership has anything to do with the ideal American life. 2 out of 3 Americans used to say that education was part of the American dream, that everybody could be well educated and have the kind of background necessary to get a good job and to get ahead, to understand the world and to be a real player in it. And today, that's down to only half of our population. More than 4 out of 5 Americans used to believe that the next generation is going to be able to live to a higher standard of life than they did. But now that has dropped to less than 4 out of 10 Americans. First time in our history when the prevailing generations did not believe that their children and grandchildren would lead a better life than they did. And it used to be that about 3 out of 4 Americans said you could trust the federal government to deal satisfactorily with domestic problems in this country. And now that number is down to just 4 out of 10 Americans. See, the bottom line basically is that what's happened is that we've shifted from wanting to be a citizen who's investing and sharing in the American dream to a nation full of individuals who possess and want to fulfill a personal dream. So it's no longer about society, it's no longer about being part of a nation, it's about me. To better understand that kind of transition, I think we have to do some more homework, and I want to share some things with you that might describe this even better. We can start out by examining some of the emerging attitudinal and value systems of America and how the shifts that are taking place in our minds and our hearts are recalibrating the American experience and expectations. What I would suggest to you is that during the past decade in particular, we've seen the introduction of really a seismic philosophical shift in our culture, particularly in terms of what our values are now.
Hey, this is Tim Barton with WallBuilders. And as you've had the opportunity to listen to WallBuilders Live, you've probably heard the wealth of information about our nation, about our spiritual heritage, about the religious liberties, about all the things that makes America exceptional. And you might be thinking, as incredible as this information is, I wish there was a way that I could get one of the WallBuilders guys to come to my area and share with my group, whether it be a church, whether it be a Christian school or public school or some political event or activity. If you're interested in having a WallBuilder speaker come to your area, you can get on our website at www.wallbuilders.com, and there's a tab for scheduling. And if you'll click on that tab, you'll notice there's a list of information from speakers' bios to events that are already going on, and there's a section where you can request an event to bring this information about who we are, where we came from, our religious liberties and freedoms. Go to the WallBuilders website and bring a speaker to your area.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
We can start by looking at some of the attitudes that we have. Attitudes are simply the favorable and unfavorable perspectives that we have or evaluations that we possess of a person, a place, a thing, or an event. And core values, we'll talk about those. Those are the central principles that are based on our core beliefs, solid beliefs that we hold about what is right or wrong and what's fundamental to our personal identity. And what I want to suggest is that those values are important. See, the attitudes lead to values when they solidify and they begin to really express who we are. And those values are critical because then they form the foundations of our worldview. And it's our worldview that becomes the personal filter, the mental, emotional, and spiritual filter that determines what we do. We do what we believe. What we believe is that our worldview is right. It's how we make sense out of reality and how we respond to it. And what I suggest to you is that currently the United States is shifting its worldview. Over the last 10 years, we've gone over the crest of the mountain to the place where we are no longer a nation that's primarily described by a theistic biblical worldview, but now we are a nation that is dominated by people who possess a postmodern and or existentialist worldview. I'm not going to get into all of that, but I do want to show you the shift in attitudes because this impacts the way that you think about and draft and push legislation. And so as we look at some of the shifts in our foundational attitudes, here's some things that I've been finding in our research. We used to be optimistic about the future, as I alluded to just a few moments ago. In the shift about the dream, we are now pessimistic about the future. We do not believe America will ever again be the champion of the world. We do not believe that our kids will live as well off as we did. We do not believe that things will ever be as great as they have been in the past. What we found is that people used to have an appreciation for stability in our culture, but right now, everyone expects change. When things aren't moving quickly, when change isn't happening, they think something's wrong. Somebody's fallen asleep at the wheel. We look at the fact that we used to give other people respect and we used to trust them simply because they were human beings. No longer the case. Now what we assume is that they're probably just like me, they're out for themselves, and so we tend to be skeptical of other people. We tend to be very critical of institutions and individuals. And we're going to say, if people want trust or respect, they better earn it first. We used to be a nation where we defined happiness as coming from things such as family, faith, friends, freedom, opportunity, contributing to society. But in the last decade or so, that's been redefined. Now we say that happiness comes from living a life defined by comfort and convenience, having multiple choices, having many interpersonal connections, having an abundance of experiences, and being independent enough to do what you want, when you want to do it, however you want to do it. Very different way of looking at happiness. And we used to think that, having a steady or deliberate pace, that there was no rush, that things would take place in their own time. That's not the way it works anymore. Faster is better, faster is necessary, faster is exciting. This is the age of multitasking, this is the age of technology, and so we believe everything's got to move faster than it ever has before if it's going to be right and proper. Those are some of the foundational attitudes in place now. They are not yet values. But if they solidify, they'll become values. We can look at some of the core values in our culture right now. Once again, some pretty radical shifts have taken place in the last 10 to 15 years. It had been a nation, America had been a nation that was defined by a Judeo-Christian moral code. Now it's all about my personal moral code. You cannot impose upon me any right or wrong perspectives. I'm the only one who can determine that for myself. Biblical virtues, whether they were humility, integrity, hope, reason, wisdom, holiness, whatever it might have been, those have gone out the window now. What we're doing instead is embracing cultural virtues such as tolerance, justice, candor, authenticity. We used to believe that this was a Christian nation, that even if you weren't Christian, it was important to respect Christ, to believe that the Bible is a book to be respected, if not cherished and followed. Most Americans identified as Christian, but that's not the case anymore. Now we live in a polytheistic society where people say, well, there are all kinds of gods. There's the Muslim God, there's the Jewish God, there's the Christian God. Hinduism has all kinds of gods, and you can't say that any of them aren't gods in our culture today. It's a very syncretistic time for faith, where people are picking and choosing from all these different religions that they're exposed to. They're choosing those things that feel good to them, and they're putting it all together into a personal form of theology that they will brand Christian, but which often has no relationship to what the Bible teaches. Absolute moral truth no longer exists. The idea of judgment is seen as being intolerant. The thing that matters now is being sensitive, being tolerant, allowing other people to feel or believe whatever they want. We've got the idea of community that was one of the hallmarks, the cornerstones of our society. That's been thrown out in favor of independence and individuality.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. In the case Lee versus Wiseman, the Supreme Court ruled that for an adult to mention the word God at a public graduation constituted both psychological and religious coercion against the students. Yet consider the actions of William Samuel Johnson, a signer of the Constitution and one of America's leading educators who served as the first president of Columbia College. At his graduation exercises, William Samuel Johnson declared to the students, "You this day have received a public education, the purpose whereof hath been to qualify you better to serve your Creator and your country. Your first great duties, you are sensible, are those you owe to heaven, to your Creator and Redeemer." Founding Father William Samuel Johnson believed that a public graduation was an appropriate setting to remind students of the duties which they owed God.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
America was made great partly because of what was known as the Protestant work ethic, people working really hard to produce things with excellence. But as you interview the workforce these days, as we do, what we find is that that's no longer the mentality that people take into their place of employment with them. The whole idea now is, sure, I'm going to work. I'm going to work only as long as I need to, only as hard as I have to, and the quality of what I produce isn't all that important. In fact, the most important thing that I produce is telling the people that run the joint what I think about what they're doing and what we're producing. We look at the whole idea of value. We used to think you delivered value by producing results. Now you deliver value by telling people what you believe. We used to accept boundaries and limitations. Now we believe that that's not something that makes sense because that takes control out of our hands. We want to have control of all the choices that get made in our lives. We don't want anybody telling us what to do, when to do it, where to do it, how to do it, or why to do it. And we used to believe that it was important to be loyal, and hence things like marriage that could last over the course of decades. You would support the people that you were loyal to, whether that was in a marriage, in a family, in the workplace, in your neighborhood, whatever. But now we don't believe in loyalty as much as we believe in seeking some advantage, exploiting every opportunity for our own personal good so that we can get ahead. That's the new mentality. See, and of course, this whole shift has been accelerated by the generation gap. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, we talked about the generation gap all the time. From the mid-70s on, you don't hear about it anymore, but it's actually as big and as significant as it's ever been. And certainly the passing of the torch from one generation to the next always creates friction and animosity as the prevailing vision of the society is reshaped and in some ways redefined. Every generation comes up with its own language as its own reality markers. But the last two generations in particular have entered the scene with a mind to pretty much fully reject the core values of their predecessors.
Well, we're out of time for today, folks. That was George Barna at the Pro-Family Legislators Conference, and we're going to finish out this series tomorrow. This is the second in a three-part series to get his presentation from the Pro-Family Legislators Conference. And again, encourage you to find out about that conference and send information on the conference to your state legislators. It's a great weekend for them once a year, coming into Dallas and just having a chance to relax with other legislators that have a biblical worldview and love our Constitution and want to return our nation to a true constitutional republic. Just a fantastic weekend. So check that out at our website, wallbuilders.com, and share it with your state legislators. And then as far as George Barna, you can find out more about him at barna.org, barna.org. That's barna.org, and we'll have a link today at wallbuilderslive.com. But check out his website. You can get a lot of great research and information there. You can also order his books, because you can get his books anywhere. Just a wealth of information. And you don't want to miss tomorrow the conclusion on his presentation from the Legislators Conference. I would imagine already that you are concerned and maybe a little bit shocked at some of the information that has been shared, but the solutions are very powerful as well. So stay with us tomorrow, and we'll get the conclusion with George Barna from the Pro-Family Legislators Conference. You've been listening to WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green.
We stand undivided.